They said she was cursed. They said she was too skinny, too quiet, and too poor to matter. In the unforgiving winter of 1874, Clara O'Malley was invisible to the world, a woman fading away in the shadow of the Montana mountains, waiting to die alone. But destiny has a strange way of knocking on the door. When a terrifying, scarred mountain man named Silas Kincaid walked into town looking for a wife, everyone laughed. They didn't know that this savage stranger held the key to a secret that would shake their town to its foundations. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the gritty, true-to-life story of how the unwanted woman became the queen of the wild. The wind in Bannock, Montana didn't just blow. It bit. It chewed through the gaps in the shiplap walls of the boarding house where Clara May O'Malley scrubbed floors for 10 cents a day. At 26 years old, Clara was considered ancient by frontier standards, an old maid with no dowry, no family, and hands roughened by lye soap. She was the daughter of an Irish prospector, Patrick O'Malley, who had died in a shaft collapse 3 years prior, leaving her with nothing but his debts and a tarnished reputation. The town of Bannock was unforgiving to women without protection. If you weren't a wife or a working girl at the Golden Garter Saloon, you were a ghost. Clara was a ghost. Miss O'Malley, the shrill voice of Mrs. Hattie Higgins. The landlady cut through the early morning chill. "That floor ain't gonna scrub itself, and I see streaks near the mudroom. You want your meal today or not?" Clara dipped her brush into the freezing grey water, her knuckles red and cracked. "Yes, Mrs. Higgins, I'm hurrying." "Hurrying? You move like a funeral procession." Hattie sneered, stepping over Clara's legs with deliberate disdain. Hattie was the wife of Mayor Josiah Higgins, the man who effectively owned Bannock. He was the one who had seized Patrick O'Malley's claim the day after the funeral, citing unpaid taxes that Clara had never seen paperwork for. Clara kept her head down. She had learned long ago that eye contact was interpreted as defiance. She was thin, gaunt, really, with hair the color of dried wheat that she kept severely pulled back. The townspeople whispered that she was barren. A rumor started by a suitor named Thomas Thorne years ago, who had courted her briefly, then abruptly married a baker's daughter. He told everyone Clara was cold as a grave and dry as a desert. The label stuck. In a world where a woman's value was measured in sons, Clara was worthless. By noon, the saloon across the street was already buzzing. Miners were filtering in, covered in dust, eager to drink away their disappointment. Clara wiped the window of the boarding house, watching the street. It was her only entertainment, watching the world live while she merely existed. That was when the silence of the street shifted. Usually the noise of Bannock was a constant hum of shouting horses and piano music. But a hush fell over the main thoroughfare, starting at the livery stable and rolling down toward the hotel like a wave. A horse was coming, a massive black percheron, more beast than mount its breath, pluming in the icy air. But it was the rider that made the miners step back onto the boardwalks. He was a giant of a man, wrapped in a buffalo hide coat that made him look twice as broad as any local. A fur trapper's hat shadowed his face, but a thick, dark beard couldn't hide the jagged white scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw. He sat heavily in the saddle, a Hawken rifle resting easily across his thighs. Clara stopped scrubbing. Her breath hitched. He looked like the mountains themselves had carved a man out of granite and pine. "Who is that?" whispered the scullery maid, a young girl named Bessie who had crept up beside Clara. "I don't know," Clara murmured. "But he doesn't look like he's here for gold." The man pulled his horse to a halt in front of the general store, directly opposite the boarding house. He didn't dismount immediately. He scanned the street, his eyes dark and unreadable. When his gaze swept past the window, Clara felt a jolt of electricity run down her spine, terrifying and thrilling all at once. He swung down from the saddle with surprising grace for a man of his size. As his boots hit the frozen mud, the town gossip, a man named Elias Vane, hurried over to Mayor Higgins, who was standing on the porch of the bank. "That's Silas Kincaid," Elias hissed loud enough for the street to hear. "The bear of the bitter roots." Clara's hand went to her throat. She had heard the stories. Silas Kincaid was a legend and a boogeyman. They said he lived 30 miles up in the high peaks where the snow never fully melted. They said he had killed a grizzly with a knife. They said he hated civilization and hadn't set foot in a town in 5 years. Why was he here? The sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long purple shadows over Bannock, when the heavy oak door of the boarding house groaned open. Mrs. Higgins bustled into the hallway looking flustered and surprisingly frightened. "Clara, get up from there. Go to the parlor. Now." Clara blinked, wiping suds from her arm. "The parlor? But I'm not finished." "Forget the floor," Hattie hissed. "Mayor Higgins is in there, and he is in there." Clara's stomach turned over. She stood, smoothing her tattered grey dress, trying to make herself presentable. She walked down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under her worn boots. Inside the parlor, the air was thick with the smell of pipe tobacco and wet fur. Mayor Josiah Higgins sat in his velvet armchair, looking small and pale. Opposite him, taking up the entire settee, was Silas Kincaid. Up close, he was even more terrifying. The smell of wood smoke and pine resin clung to him. His hands resting on his knees were the size of shovels, scarred and stained. He didn't stand when Clara entered. He just looked at her. His eyes were not dark as she had thought from the window, but a piercing, startling blue like glacial ice. "This is her," Mayor Higgins said, his voice trembling slightly. "Clara O'Malley. Patrick's girl." Silas looked her up and down. It wasn't a lecherous look. It was the look of a man buying a horse. He checked her standing, her posture, the way she held her hands. "She's thin," Silas rumbled. His voice was deep, a gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floor. "She eats little," Higgins said quickly. "Cheap to keep." Clara felt a flush of shame burn her neck. "I'm standing right here," she said, her voice quiet but steady. It was the first time she had spoken out of turn in months. Silas's eyes snapped to hers. He seemed surprised. "She speaks." "She has a tongue," Higgins scoffed, "though she rarely uses it for anything useful. Look, Kincaid, you said you needed a woman. There isn't anyone else. The widows are all remarried and the young ones have fathers who wouldn't let you within a mile of them. Clara." "Well, Clara is available." Silas stood up. He towered over her. Clara had to crane her neck to look him in the eye. He stepped closer, invading her space. She refused to flinch, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "I need a wife," Silas said, addressing Clara directly for the first time. "Not for love, not for comfort. I have a cabin up in the breaks. It's hard living. I need someone to cook, to mend, and to keep the fire when I'm running lines. The winter is going to be bad this year. My last partner didn't make it." Clara swallowed hard. "Your partner died of gangrene, frostbite," Silas said bluntly. "I can't run the trap line and the house alone. I need a contract." "A marriage," Clara corrected. "A contract," Silas repeated. "I pay your debts. I take you out of this hole. You work for me. You get food, warmth, and protection. If you survive the winter and you want to leave come spring, I'll give you $50 and a mule." $50. It was a fortune. It was freedom. "And if I say no?" Clara asked. Mayor Higgins laughed a cruel, dry sound. "Then you're out on the street, Clara. Hattie's tired of you. I'm selling this building next week to the mining company. You have nowhere to go." Clara looked at the mayor, seeing the malice in his watery eyes. He hated her because her father had known about his shady dealings. He wanted her gone. She looked back at Silas Kincaid. He was frightening, yes, a savage mountain man. But in his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in the mayor's eyes, honesty. He was offering a transaction cold and hard, but true. "I have conditions," Clara said, her voice trembling. The mayor gasped. "You have what?" Silas held up a hand to silence the mayor. He looked at Clara with a flicker of interest. "Name them." "I will not be treated like a slave," she said, digging her fingernails into her palms. "I will eat what you eat. I will have my own corner of the cabin. And I want my father's Bible. The mayor took it." Silas turned his head slowly to Higgins. "Give it to her. Now see here, Kincaid, that's property of the—" Silas didn't move, but his hand drifted toward the Bowie knife on his belt. It was a subtle shift, but the threat filled the room like sock. "Give it to her." Higgins scrambled up, went to the mantel, and retrieved a worn, leather-bound book. He shoved it into Clara's hands. Clara clutched the book to her chest, the leather smelling of her father's pipe. She looked at Silas. "I'll go," she whispered. Silas nodded once. "Pack your things. We ride in 10 minutes. 10 minutes, but it's nearly dark," Clara stammered. "The snow is coming," Silas said, turning his back on the mayor. "And on the mountain the dark is the least of your worries. If we don't make the ridge by midnight, the wolves will find us." Clara ran to her small cupboard under the stairs. She had so little: 2 dresses, a shawl, a comb, and now her Bible. As she shoved them into a burlap sack, she realized her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was leaving the hell of Bannock, but she was riding into the wilderness with the devil himself. As she walked out into the biting twilight, Silas hoisted her onto the back of the massive black horse. Her arms went around his waist tentatively. The buffalo coat was coarse, but underneath he was warm, radiating a heat that defied the winter wind. "Hold on," he growled. The horse surged forward, leaving the lights of Bannock behind. As they climbed the trail into the pitch-black tree line, Clara looked back once. The town was just a speck of yellow light in a sea of darkness. She was terrified, but for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't lonely. She was in the hands of the mountain. The world ended at the timberline. That was how it felt to Clara, as the great black horse, whom Silas called Obsidian, trudged through snow that was now knee-deep. They had been riding for 6 hours in a silence broken only by the crunch of hooves and the wind howling through the lodgepole pines. Clara's body had gone past pain and settled into a numb, rhythmic throbbing. Her hands, wrapped around Silas's waist, were frozen into claws. Every time the horse slipped on a patch of ice, she gasped, tightening her grip, pressing her face into the rough buffalo hide of Silas's coat. "Stop squirming!" Silas shouted over the wind. It wasn't a reprimand, just a command. We're at the Devil's Backbone. One wrong move, and we drop 2,000 feet. Clara dared to open her eyes. To her left was a wall of sheer granite. To her right, a drop into an abyss so black it looked like the throat of a monster. The trail was barely wide enough for the horse. "Why?" Clara's voice cracked, dry and weak. "Why do you live so high up?" "Because people don't," Silas replied. They crested the ridge just as the moon broke through the storm clouds. The sight that greeted them was terrifyingly beautiful. A high alpine valley, a bowl of white carved out of the mountain peaks, sat suspended in the sky. In the center, half buried in a drift, was a cabin built of logs so thick they looked like ancient trees felled by giants. Smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney. Silas whistled a sharp sound that echoed off the canyon walls. As they approached the cabin, the door did not open. No warm light spilled out to greet them. This was not a home. It was a fortress against the elements. Silas slid off the horse and reached up, grabbing Clara by the waist. He swung her down as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour. Her legs, numb from the ride, collapsed under her. She fell into the snow, gasping as the cold powder hit her face. She expected him to help her up. He didn't. He was already uncinching the saddle. "Get inside," he said, jerking his head toward the door. "Fire needs stoking. Wood box is to the left of the hearth. Don't touch the iron trunk at the foot of the bed." Clara scrambled to her feet, shaking the snow from her skirts. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The cabin was one large room, smelling of wood smoke, cured leather, and something metallic like dried blood. The only light came from the embers in the massive stone fireplace. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the interior was Spartan. A table made of rough-hewn planks, 2 stump chairs, a wall of shelves filled with jars, and in the corner, a single large bed covered in a pile of furs. Above the fireplace hung the skull of a bull elk, its antlers spanning 6 feet, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. Clara shivered, not just from the cold. She moved to the hearth, her trembling fingers struggling to find the kindling. She could hear Silas outside, talking low to the horse, the sound of the saddle hitting the porch railing. She managed to get a flame going just as Silas entered, kicking the snow off his boots. He carried 2 large saddlebags and a rifle. He locked the door behind him with a heavy iron bolt. "There's stew in the pot from yesterday," he said, hanging his coat on a peg. Without the bulk of the buffalo hide, he was still massive, wearing a thick flannel shirt and suspenders. The scar on his face looked jagged in the firelight, pulling his left eye slightly downward. "Where do I sleep?" Clara asked, looking at the single bed. Silas paused, looking at the bed, then at her. He walked over to a pile of blankets in the corner, grabbed 2, and tossed them onto the floor near the fire. "You take the bed," he grunted. "I take the floor. I'm used to hard ground." Clara felt a wave of relief so potent it made her knees weak. "But the contract. You said—" "I said I needed a wife to work." Silas cut her off, his voice hard. "I didn't say I needed a whore. You do your part, cooking, cleaning, mending. I do mine. We keep the winter out. That's the deal." He sat at the table and began cleaning his rifle, the metal clicking rhythmically. Clara stood by the fire, her hands hovering over the warmth. "Thank you, Mr. Kincaid," she whispered. "Silas," he corrected, without looking up. "And don't thank me yet. You haven't seen the dawn. The wind screams up here in the morning. If you let the fire die, we freeze. If you leave the door unbolted, the bears get in. You're not in Bannock anymore, Clara. There's no mayor to hate you here. There's just the mountain." And the mountain doesn't hate you. It just doesn't care if you live or die. Clara looked at the man, this stranger who had bought her life for $50. He was terrifying, yes. But as she watched him oil the trigger of his gun, she realized he was the first man she had ever met who didn't look at her with pity or disgust. He looked at her like a tool he was testing for durability. And for the first time in her life, Clara decided she would be durable. She would not break. The first 2 weeks were a war of attrition. Clara learned quickly that keeping house for a mountain man was nothing like cleaning the boarding house. Here the dirt was relentless. It wasn't dust. It was mud, pine, sap, blood from the traps and soot. Silas was gone before sunrise every morning. He would drink a cup of coffee black as tar, eat a piece of hardtack, and vanish into the grey light to check his trap lines. He wouldn't return until after dark, usually carrying the carcasses of beaver marten, or sometimes a deer. Clara's days were filled with labor. She had to chop kindling, a task she was terrible at, initially often sending the axe flying until she learned the rhythm of it. She had to haul water from the creek, which required breaking the ice with a sledgehammer first. The bucket was heavy, the hill steep, and the air so cold it burned her lungs like smoke. But the hardest part was the silence. Silas barely spoke. He would come home, eat the stew she prepared, which was improving thanks to the herbs she found in his jars, and then sit by the fire repairing his gear. He watched her, though. Clara could feel his blue eyes tracking her movements as she swept the floor or mended his torn shirts. It was during the 3rd week that the truce cracked. Clara decided to clean the shelves near the back of the cabin. They were cluttered with old tins, ammunition boxes, and a layer of grime that looked years old. As she moved a heavy box of percussion caps, her hand brushed against something soft tucked behind it. She pulled it out. It was a ribbon. A blue silk ribbon, fine and delicate, the kind a city woman would wear in her hair. Clara stared at it. It was clean, unlike everything else in the cabin. It smelled faintly of lavender. "What are you doing?" The voice was a thunderclap. Clara jumped, dropping the ribbon. Silas was standing in the doorway, blocking the light. He had returned early. He dropped a brace of rabbits on the floor and crossed the room in 2 strides. He snatched the ribbon from the floor, his hand shaking slightly. His face, usually stoic, was twisted in a snarl of rage. "I told you," he growled, stepping into her personal space, forcing her back against the shelves. "You clean the floor. You cook the food. You do not dig through my things." "I wasn't digging," Clara stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I was cleaning the shelf. It was behind the box. Silas, who—" "Silence!" he roared. It was the first time he had raised his voice to a shout. He turned away, his chest heaving. He walked to the fire and stood there, gripping the ribbon in his massive fist. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara stood trembling, fearing she had finally pushed the bear too far. After a long minute, Silas spoke. His voice was low, devoid of the anger from moments before, replaced by a weary exhaustion. Her name was Sarah. Clara didn't move. She waited. "She was my wife," Silas said, staring into the flames. 5 years ago. We came up here. I thought I could keep her safe. I thought I knew this mountain." He turned to look at Clara. The firelight caught the scar on his face, making it look like a fresh wound. "A panther," he said softly. "It came in the winter. I was out checking the south line. I came back. The door was open. Clara covered her mouth with her hand, a gasp escaping her lips. I killed it. Silas said, his eyes hard and glassy. I tracked it for 3 days, and I killed it with my hands. That's where I got this. He touched the scar, but it didn't bring her back. He walked over to the iron trunk at the foot of the bed, the one he had forbidden her to touch. He pulled a key from a chain around his neck and opened it. He placed the blue ribbon gently inside, then locked it again. I brought you here because I can't do it alone anymore, Silas said, looking at the floor. But don't mistake this arrangement. You are here to help me survive. You are not here to replace her. You are not here to be her. Do not touch her things again. He grabbed his coat and stormed back out into the snow, leaving Clara alone with the rabbits bleeding on the floor. Clara sank onto one of the stump chairs. She looked at the iron trunk. The town gossip had been wrong. Silas Kincaid wasn't a monster because he hated people. He was a monster because he was in mourning so deep it had turned him to stone. She realized then that the danger wasn't the wolves or the cold. The danger was the ghost of Sarah living in every corner of this cabin. Silas had married Clara to keep his body alive, but his heart was locked in that iron trunk. That night a blizzard struck. The wind hit the cabin like a physical blow, shaking the logs. The temperature plummeted. Clara kept the fire roaring nervously, watching the door. Silas had not returned. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The snow was piling up against the windows, blocking out the world. "He's not coming back," a voice in her head whispered. "He left you just like he found you." But Clara stood up. She went to the window and scraped away the frost. She could see nothing but a wall of white, swirling violence. She looked at the warm bed, then at the rifle by the door. She thought of the man who had pulled her from the gutter of Bannock, the man who carried a blue ribbon in a box of ammunition. "No," she said aloud to the empty room. "I am not a ghost, and I am not a widow." She grabbed her shawl, wrapping it tight. She threw a heavy log on the fire to ensure it would last. Then she did something reckless. She took the lantern, lit it, and placed it in the window, a beacon. Then she opened to the door. The wind nearly knocked her backward. The snow was waist-deep on the porch. She couldn't go out there. She would die in minutes. But she could make noise. Clara grabbed a heavy iron skillet and the ladle. She stepped onto the porch, the wind screaming in her ears, freezing her tears instantly. She began to bang the metal together. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was sharp, piercing through the howl of the wind. "Silas!" she screamed into the dark. "Silas!" She banged until her arm felt like it would fall off. She screamed until her throat was raw. The cold was seeping into her bones, turning her blood to slush. Just as she was about to give up, just as the numbness was starting to feel like sleep, a shape emerged from the white, swirling void. It was the horse Obsidian, looking like a ghost steed covered in ice. And slumped over the horse's neck was Silas. Clara dropped the skillet and lunged into the snow. She grabbed the bridle, pulling the exhausted horse towards the porch. Silas was barely conscious, his face grey, his beard a mask of ice. "Silas!" She grabbed his coat, pulling him down. He fell heavily onto the porch, groaning. "Leg!" he rasped. "Broke it!" Clara didn't think. She didn't worry about her size or his. Adrenaline, fierce and hot, flooded her veins. She dragged him 200 pounds of dead weight across the threshold and into the cabin. She slammed the door shut and bolted it against the storm. Silas lay on the floor, shivering violently. His right leg was twisted at a sickening angle below the knee. Clara looked at him. The bear of the bitter roots was broken. He looked up at her, his eyes hazy with pain and hypothermia. "You," he chattered, "you opened the door." "I'm the wife," Clara said, her voice shaking, but her hands steady as she reached for his knife to cut his boot off. "And the contract says I keep the fire. Now lie still, Silas. This is going to hurt." For the first time since she arrived, Clara wasn't the poor, lonely spinster. She was the only thing standing between Silas Kincaid and death, and she had no intention of losing. The storm raged for 3 days, sealing the cabin in a tomb of white. But inside a different kind of storm was fighting to break. Clara had never set a bone in her life. She had scrubbed floors, mended sheets, and plucked chickens, but she had never held a man's life in her hands. Silas lay on the dining table where she had dragged him. He was conscious now, but his face was a mask of grey sweat. The angle of his right leg was wrong, horribly. Stomach-churningly wrong. "You have to pull it." Silas gritted out, his teeth clenched so hard Clara thought they might crack. "If you don't set it straight, now I'll be a cripple forever, or the rot will take it." Clara's hands shook as she held the bottle of whiskey she'd found on the shelf. I don't know if I have the strength, Silas." "You dragged me in here." He wheezed, his blue eyes locking onto hers. They were filled with pain, but also a strange, intense trust. "You have the strength. You just don't know it yet." He took the bottle, drinking deeply, the amber liquid spilling into his beard. He drank until the bottle was half empty, then shoved a piece of thick leather belt between his teeth. "Do it," he mumbled around the leather. "On 3. Don't stop when I scream." Clara took a breath. The air in the cabin was hot and smelled of copper and wet wool. She moved to the foot of the table. She placed her hands on his ankle and his calf. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin. 1, she whispered. Silas gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white. 2. Clara closed her eyes, prayed to the God her father believed in, and pulled. She pulled with every ounce of frustration, fear, and anger that had built up in her over the last 10 years. She pulled for the girl who was ignored in Bannock. She pulled for the woman who was told she was worthless. Silas screamed. It was a guttural animal sound that seemed to shake the roof beams. Clara felt the bone grind, then a sickening pop as it slid back into alignment. Silas's body arched off the table, then collapsed. He had passed out. Clara didn't stop. She worked frantically, using the slats from a crate to fashion a splint, tearing her petticoat into strips to bind it tight. Only when the leg was secure did she allow herself to collapse into the chair, sobbing silently into her hands. The next week was a blur of fever and firelight. Silas didn't wake fully. The pain and the shock sent him into a delirium. His temperature spiked, his skin burning to the touch. Clara became a spectre in the cabin. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. Her entire existence narrowed down to keeping the fire alive and keeping Silas cool. She bathed his face with snow she melted in a bowl. She trickled broth down his throat, drop by drop. She listened to him mumble in his sleep. He didn't talk about bears or mountains. He talked about a garden. "The roses, Sarah. They need water," he would whisper, his hand thrashing. "Don't let the frost get the roses." Clara listened, her heart aching. This giant of a man who killed predators with his bare hands was dreaming of gardening with his dead wife. It made him human in a way that terrified her, because it made her care, and caring was dangerous. On the 5th night, the fever broke. Clara had fallen asleep in the chair, her head resting on the edge of the bed where she had moved him. She woke to the feeling of a hand on her hair. She jerked up, disoriented. Silas was watching her. His eyes were clear, the glacial blue sharp again, though shadowed with exhaustion. His hand, calloused and rough, was resting gently on her head. "You stayed," he rasped. His voice was like grinding stones. Clara sat back, smoothing her apron, trying to hide her flustered state. "The contract," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I have duties." Silas looked at his splintered leg, then back at her. A ghost of a smile, the first she had ever seen, touched his lips. It transformed his face, softening the scar, making him look younger. "To hell with the contract, Clara," he whispered. "You saved my life." Clara looked down at her hands. They were red, chapped, and dirty. "I just did what needed doing." "No," Silas said firmly. He shifted, wincing, but kept his eyes on her. "Bannock, they told me you were weak. They told me you were a mouse. They were wrong. You're a wolf, Clara. You just didn't know how to howl." Clara felt a flush rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time in her life, a man was looking at her with admiration. Not for her beauty, which she knew she lacked, but for her spirit. "I made stew," she said quickly, needing to do something with her hands. "I'm starving," he said, as she fed him, spooning the broth into his mouth because his hands were too shaky. The dynamic in the cabin shifted. The fear was gone. The distance was gone. They were no longer master and servant, or buyer and purchase. They were two survivors huddled against the dark bound by blood and bone. Winter in the high country does not leave quietly. It fights a retreating battle. But eventually the sun began to linger longer in the sky. The icicles hanging from the eaves, which had grown to the size of spears, began to drip. 6 weeks had passed since the accident. Silas was mending, but he was still confined to the cabin. For a man used to roaming hundreds of miles, the confinement was torture. He paced the small room on crutches he had whittled from tree branches, growling at the walls like a chained lion. But the evenings were different. With Silas unable to hunt or work the lines, the silence that had once defined their evenings was filled with words. Clara learned to whittle. Silas taught her how to handle a knife, how to find the grain of the wood. She sat by the fire carving a small bird while he oiled his traps. "Tell me about him," Silas asked one night. The wind was howling outside a spring storm, but inside it was warm. "About who?" Clara asked, not looking up from her carving. "The man who made you think you were invisible." Clara's knife slipped, nicking her thumb. She put the digit in her mouth, tasting copper. She looked at Silas. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring into the fire, giving her the privacy to speak or stay silent. "His name was Thomas," she said softly. "He was handsome. He courted me for a summer. I was 19. I thought he saw me. But he was just passing time. He wanted a loan from my father. When father refused, Thomas moved on to the baker's daughter the next day. He laughed about me in the saloon, said I was dry and dull." Silas scoffed a harsh sound. The man was a fool and blind. And then Father died. Clara continued, the old hurt feeling less sharp now, dulled by the distance of the mountain. And Mayor Higgins took the claim, and suddenly I was just debris. Something left over. Silas turned to her. He reached out and took the piece of wood from her hand. He inspected the bird she was carving. It was rough, but it had wings. You aren't debris, Clara. You're the foundation, he said seriously. This cabin. It was cold before you came. Even with the fire lit, it was cold. I was just haunting it. You brought the life back. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She looked at him, really looked at him. The beard was trimmed now, she had done it for him. The wildness was still there, but it was tempered. He was a handsome man, she realized with a start. Rugged and scarred, yes, but noble. And Sarah. Clara asked the name, feeling risky on her tongue. Silas didn't flinch this time. He looked at the iron trunk, then back at Clara. Sarah was the sunlight, he said quietly. She was soft. She loved this mountain for its beauty, but she didn't respect its teeth. I loved her. I always will. He paused, shifting his bad leg. But a man can't live on sunlight alone, he said, his voice dropping an octave. Sometimes he needs a fire that burns steady through the storm, a fire that doesn't go out when the wind blows. He looked at Clara, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. He was comparing Sarah to the sun and her to the fire. It wasn't a replacement. It was a different kind of necessity. The snow is melting, Clara whispered, changing the subject because the air was becoming too thick with unspoken things. The pass will be clear soon. The reality of her words hung in the air. If you survive the winter and you want to leave, come spring, I'll give you $50 and a mule. That was the deal. Silas's face hardened slightly. Yes, it will. The contract, Clara began. I remember the contract. Silas snapped, suddenly angry. He grabbed his crutches and heaved himself up. You've earned your money. You've earned every cent. You kept me alive. You cleaned my house. You put up with a cripple. He hobbled to the loose stone in the hearth where he kept his savings. He pulled out a heavy leather pouch and threw it on the table. It landed with a heavy thud. There's gold dust in there, worth more than $50. Worth enough to get you to San Francisco. Buy a dress, buy a shop. Find a husband who doesn't live in a cave. Clara stared at the pouch. It was her freedom. It was everything she had dreamed of while scrubbing Mrs. Higgins's floors. Is that what you want? She asked quietly. You want me to go? Silas turned his back to her, leaning heavily on the mantel. His shoulders were tense. It's not about what I want, Clara. It's about what you deserve. You deserve a life, not this. He gestured vaguely at the skins, the logs, the isolation. I am a broken man living on a rock. You have a future. Clara stood up. She walked over to the table and picked up the pouch. It was heavy. She walked up behind Silas. He stiffened but didn't turn around. You're right, she said. I do deserve a life. She reached past him and placed the pouch back on the mantel. Silas turned his head, shock registering in his eyes. But I get to choose what that life looks like, Clara said, her voice steady. And I'm not done carving my bird yet. Silas turned fully, his crutches clattering to the floor as he let them fall, balancing on his good leg and the mantel. He reached out his large hand, cupping her cheek. His thumb traced her jawline, his touch incredibly gentle. Clara, he breathed. He leaned down, and for the first time he kissed her. It wasn't the kiss of a refined gentleman. It tasted of coffee and wood smoke. It was rough and hungry and desperate. It was the kiss of a man who had been drowning and had finally found air. Clara wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, melting into the buffalo coat she had once feared. She wasn't the unwanted spinster anymore. She was desired. She was home. But the mountain does not allow for happily ever afters without a price. 2 days later, the thaw had cleared the lower trail. Clara was outside, hanging laundry on the line, humming a tune she hadn't thought of in years. The sun was bright, blindingly so off the remaining snow. She heard the sound first, the crunch of hooves. She smiled, thinking it might be a deer, and turned. Her smile vanished. Riding up the trail was not a deer. It was a posse of 3 men. And leading them, sitting atop a chestnut mare, wearing a fine wool coat that looked out of place in the wild, was Mayor Josiah Higgins. He wasn't alone. Beside him rode the sheriff of Bannock and a man Clara didn't recognize, a man with a notebook and a surveyor's transit. Clara dropped the basket of wet clothes. She turned and ran for the cabin. "Silas!" she screamed. "Silas, they're here!" Silas was cleaning his rifle at the table. He looked up, confused. "Who?" "Higgins," she gasped, slamming the door and sliding the bolt. "He's got the sheriff and another man." Silas's face went dark. He didn't ask questions. He grabbed the rifle and stood up, ignoring his crutches, putting weight on his healing leg through sheer force of will. "Stay behind me," he ordered. He threw the door open just as the riders pulled up to the porch. Mayor Higgins looked older, but his sneer was the same. He looked at Silas, then at Clara, who was peeking out from behind Silas's broad back. "Well, well," Higgins laughed, though his eyes were nervous as they flicked to the rifle in Silas's hands. "Looks like the rumors were wrong. The girl survived. And look at you, Kincaid. You look like you've gone soft, playing house." "Get off my land, Higgins," Silas warned, raising the barrel of the Hawken slightly. "You have 10 seconds before I put a box in your horse, and the next one goes in you." Now, no need for violence," Higgins said, holding up a hand. He smirked, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "And it's not your land anymore, Kincaid." Silas froze. "What are you talking about?" "The survey lines were redrawn," Higgins said, his voice dripping with triumph. "The mining company found a vein of copper that runs right under this ridge. According to the new county maps, this cabin is squatting on company property. My company's property." He threw the paper onto the snow at Silas's feet. "You have 24 hours to vacate." Higgins smiled, looking directly at Clara. "Or the sheriff here will burn it down, with you in it." The eviction notice lay in the snow like a white flag. But Silas knew it was a declaration of war. "He's lying," Silas growled, slamming the heavy wooden bolt of the door shut. He limped to the table, spreading out his hand-drawn map. "My claim is registered in Helena. The copper vein he's talking about is on the lower slope. Higgins is trying to push the boundary line to steal my timber and water." Clara stared at the notice, her mind racing. "It's not just the timber, Silas. It's the cover-up." She grabbed her father's worn leather Bible from the mantel. Her hands trembled as she took a paring knife to the inside cover. Father didn't trust banks. He said the truth was the only thing the devil couldn't burn. She sliced the stitching. Hidden beneath the leather was a folded document thin as onion skin. "Look," Clara whispered, unfolding it. It was a federal mining claim, dated 3 years prior, signed by the Surveyor General in Washington, not the corrupt local office. Silas scanned the coordinates, and his eyes widened. The O'Malley strike. It isn't here. It's directly under the boarding house in town, Clara said, her voice rising. Higgins didn't just steal my inheritance. He's been digging in the wrong place for 3 years. He thinks the vein runs up here because he missed the actual lode. If the sheriff sees this federal deed, Higgins hangs for fraud and theft. That's why he's coming back with guns, Silas said grimly, reaching for his Spencer carbine. He knows you have the book. Night fell like a shroud. Silas boarded the windows, leaving only narrow slits. They waited in the cold dark, the silence heavy with the threat of violence. At dawn, the first bullet shattered the quiet, thudding into the log wall inches from Silas's head. "Get down!" Silas roared, tackling Clara, as the cabin erupted in chaos. Glass shattered as a volley of gunfire hammered the house from the tree line. Silas crawled to the window, the Hawken rifle booming as he returned fire. "They're trying to flank us. Watch the back." Clara grabbed the heavy Colt pistol and scrambled to the rear door. She heard the crunch of boots on snow. Smoke began to curl under the doorframe, the smell of kerosene. "Burn them out," she heard Higgins scream from the yard. "Torch the roof! Silas the fire!" Clara coughed, the smoke thickening instantly. "We have to run. If we run, they shoot us down like dogs," Silas shouted over the roar of the flames, now licking at the porch. "We hold the ground." "No," Clara said, her eyes stinging. She looked at the federal deed in her hand. She grabbed a white tablecloth from the shelf. "We don't run. We end this." Before Silas could stop her, Clara threw the bolt and kicked the door open. She stepped out onto the burning porch, the flames roaring around her, waving the white cloth high above her head. "Cease fire!" she screamed into the smoke. "Sheriff Miller!" "Cease fire!" The gunfire sputtered and died. The sheriff and his deputies emerged from the trees, rifles raised. Mayor Higgins rode forward on his chestnut mare, his face twisted in triumph. "Shoot her!" Higgins shrieked. "She's armed?" "I am armed with the truth," Clara yelled, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. She held up the document. "This is the federal deed to the O'Malley claim. It proves you stole my father's mine. It proves that you forged the sale, you're trespassing Josiah Higgins, and you're attempting murder to cover it up." The sheriff lowered his rifle, squinting at the official seal on the paper. He looked at Higgins. "Josiah, is that a federal survey?" "It's a lie." Higgins panicked, foam gathering at his mouth. He drew his revolver. "She's a witch. Kill her." Higgins raised his gun, aiming squarely at Clara's chest. Clara didn't flinch. She stood tall in the inferno. Crack! The shot didn't come from Higgins. Through the flames of the doorway behind Clara, a single puff of smoke curled from Silas's rifle. Higgins gasped, a red flower blooming on his shoulder. He dropped his pistol and fell from his horse, screaming in the snow. Silas limped out of the burning cabin, the smoking gun in his hand, and wrapped his arm around Clara, shielding her. The sheriff walked up, snatched the deed from Clara, and read it. He looked at the wounded mayor, then back at his deputies. "Arrest him!" Sheriff Miller barked. "Fraud, grand larceny, and attempted murder," as the deputies dragged the screaming mayor away. Silas pulled Clara tight against his chest. They were covered in soot, shaking and homeless for the moment, but they were alive. "You saved us," Silas whispered into her hair. "We saved us," Clara replied. 6 months later, the snow was gone. The cabin had been rebuilt, the logs fresh and golden in the sun. On the south side, protected by a new stone wall, A garden bloomed, wild roses and vegetables growing side by side. Clara sat in a rocking chair on the wide porch. She was no longer the gaunt, lonely ghost of Bannock. She wore a dress of fine blue calico, and her face glowed with health. Silas walked out, moving without his crutches, though a permanent limp remained a badge of the winter that had forged them. He carried 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her. "He's finally asleep," Clara whispered, looking down at the bundle in her lap. A baby boy, 3 weeks old, with a shock of black hair, slept soundly in the mountain air. Silas reached out his large, scarred hand, gently touching his son's cheek. "He's strong," he said softly, "like his mother." Clara leaned her head on her husband's shoulder. They had been castaways thrown together by desperation and a cruel town. But looking at the valley below, Clara knew she wasn't poor. She was Clara Kincaid, the richest woman in the territory and the queen of the wild. And that is the legend of Clara and Silas. It's a reminder that sometimes the people society throws away are the ones with the most fight in them. Clara O'Malley didn't just survive the winter. She conquered it, proving that true love is forged in the fire of survival. What did you think of Clara's bravery? Would you have walked out onto that burning porch? Let me know in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another tale from the Wild West. Until next time, keep your fires burning.